Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. We've got another nice British-made classic bike for you to take a look at here. And this bike is also quite rare due to the fact that there was only really a handful of these British-made machines made back in the 1960s. So let's jump straight into that video and take a look at Peter Remington's 1963 Dot CZ. Now, Dot Motorcycles was yet another one of the well-known British motorcycle manufacturers who were originally founded by the great Harry Reid in Salford in Manchester in 1903, and it's said that by 1906 Dot had already built their first motorcycle, which was said to be powered by a French Peugeot engine. Now, the history of the great Dot factory is comprehensive and quite intriguing and just far too complex and involved for us to cover in this short video, although it's suffice to say that during their long and many years of producing motorcycles, they certainly manufactured a vast array of road machines, trials bikes, road racing bikes, and of course their well-renowned scrambles bikes as well. But just before we get down to our featured bike, in these few examples that we're going to take a look at here, we've taken a few bikes from my video archive so that you can see just how diverse Dot actually were when it came to providing bikes for the masses. So this first example that we're looking at here is a 1952 Dot Villiers 197cc Trials model TD. Now, this bike in that year had a 3-speed gearbox and a 2-stroke Villiers engine with a direct lighting system that was operated straight from the engine's magneto. Now, of course, by now I'm sure that you're already aware that Dot, or DOT, was eventually given the title Devoid of Trouble, which of course was a catchy title, but in reality these Dots, just like every other single motorcycle in the world, weren't devoid of trouble, and they certainly had their issues just like every other bike on the planet. But nevertheless, they did manufacture some great machines, including this 1952 model TD trials bike. And over the course of more than 50 years, Dot did produce a wide variety of machines. Most, it has to be said, were powered by Villiers 2-stroke engines, and this early 1952 trials road machine is certainly a fine and extremely rare example. Now, in this next example, this is a Dot trials bike. It's another fine looking machine produced by the Dot factory, although I'm not actually sure of its year, but it's probably from the late 1960s or early 1970s. But these lightweight trials machines did have a simple but very light steel frame that usually consisted of a square box section front and rear down tube with some light gauge tubular steel there to make up the remainder of the bike's chassis. But these bikes were minimalist in the extreme, with certainly no unnecessary parts bolted onto them that would increase their weight, which is why it made them so popular as trials or even scrambles machines, because these bikes were super lightweight, which made them very manoeuvrable, and with that relatively light Villiers 2-stroke motor, the bike was absolutely perfect for use off-road, due of course to their use of that light gauge steel and alloy construction. But as I said, this is just one small example of the lovely trials bikes that Dot produced. But just one final example here before we get down to our featured machine. Now this is just a quick look around another lovely Dot, and this fine example here is John Rogerson's 1970 250 Scrambler. Now this particular example here of John's has been fully restored, as you can see, and this is a superb example of one of these 1970s Dot 250 Scramblers. But as I said, these bikes were very well built for their time, and most of these Scrambles versions had those unusual leading link front forks with those quite long external dampers that ran down either side of the front wheel. But up until 1968, when Dot eventually stopped building motorcycles, they had still produced a huge variety of road, trail and scrambles machines that were very good quality and sold at a decent price for their home UK market. But it's certainly worthwhile checking out the full history of the Dot brand if you want to know the full story on this iconic British motorcycle manufacturing company. So anyhow, let's get down to our featured bike, which again is another rare machine that I came across at last year's Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And this example here is again another Dot Scrambler, but it's not powered by this stock Villiers engine this time, but by a Czechoslovakian CZ or CZ motor if you're watching this in the USA, because I know that you guys over there like to call them CZs, but over here in Europe we've always referred to these bikes as simply CZs. Anyhow, so this featured Dot 250 Scrambler is said to be one of a very small number of factory bikes that were built for the works riders of their day, and it's documented that in 1963 only 3 bikes were actually ever made with these CZ twin port motors, although our bike here was a one-off special that was said to be made for its owner Peter Remington back in 1993. So essentially this could be called model number 4, but it's not exactly clear as to what happened to the 3 original factory bikes, so this could even be the last surviving example of one of these rare twin port 250 Dot racers. But I can certainly see the logic in the thinking of the Dot bigwigs to fit these CZ twin port engines into their light steel frames, because although the old Villiers engines would have still done a decent enough job as a power plant on these factory bikes, you just can't help thinking that these Czechoslovakian motors were a much better choice, because these twin porters were very powerful even for a 2-stroke 250, and some of the world's top riders were making good use of these engines in the 1960s and 70s and enjoying major successes while using them to power their race bikes. And in actual fact, one of those famous riders was the great Joël Robert, who raced a CZ with one of these twin port motors in it in 1964, which at that time, if you remember, the riders had to have their left hand on their crash helmets for the one-handed starts that they used back in the day, and Joel used to stick the heel of his left boot on this clutch operating arm to hold the clutch disengaged, so that when the flag dropped he could then just bang the bike into gear and he was away. But Peter's rare 250 as you can see, still has the original Zhikov carburetor fitted onto it, which in the 1960s was a bit prone to leaking and the occasional flooding, which is why many riders swapped these for something with a bit more quality, although when they were working correctly, these old Zhikovs still did a very good job. Now, as in the previous examples that we showed you earlier on in the video, these CZ Dot Works machines had much the same chassis with these quite radical looking leading link suspension units that had quite a long shock absorber that ran down either side of the front wheel, and although it looked quite unusual for its day, it actually worked surprisingly well for an old school idea. But then again, these Dot scramblers weren't exactly heavy bikes, so this leading link system was still adequate for such a light 250 two-stroke racer. But it wasn't only these Dots that utilised these leading link suspension systems on their vintage scrambles bikes, because the British-made Greaves machines also used a similar system on their Challenger and Griffin bikes from that same 1960s period. But the front and the rear brakes and hubs on these Dots were very small, as you can see, and certainly they never had huge stopping power as you'd expect, but they were probably quite adequate at best. Now, the bike's rear brake again was much the same as the front, although having said that, this rear drum is actually a CZ item, which, as I remember, did have very good brakes for an old school drum braking system. But certainly a common feature on both the Trials versions and these Dot scramblers were these polished alloy fuel tanks, and naturally the Trials tanks were a bit smaller and much slimmer, while these Scrambles tanks tended to be bigger and bulkier, obviously to hold more fuel due to their heavier fuel consumption. But they were all very well made and usually had one of those Monza style locking fuel caps there on the top, and almost all, of course, had the British badge on the side with the Dot devoid of trouble logo on the side as well. Now, our CZ Dots seat, once more, as you can see, was very basic, but it did have a decent amount of padding to help make up for the minimum amount of rear suspension travel that these bikes enjoyed way back in the day. So it wasn't that you could shift your weight around on the bike as you can on a slightly more modern machine, but you still have to remember that this was the early 1960s, and these kind of seats were just a stock standard fitting on most off-road British-made scramblers. And so at the back end of Peter's 250, there were, of course, no such things as fancy gas piggyback or remote reservoir suspension systems for these bikes in 1963, and it was probably just a pair of basic British-made Girling dampers that would have been used on these old Dot racers. And these vintage systems were certainly a world away from what we have now, but there was no need to look for any other kind of replacements in that year, because there wasn't much choice either. So this is what you had to make do with at that time. And once more, at the business end of our Dot CZ, these handlebar clamps are quite unusual items, and certainly the kind that you would have found on one of these old 1960s Dot motocrossers, but the bike's handlebars are certainly the real deal, because they did used to weld the crossbar on these bars way back in the day, and nowadays this is certainly a good way of identifying that you've got an original pair of bars for one of these old vintage racers. But even the bike's controls and levers look like the proper 1960s parts, and those hangers for the clutch and brake levers are again welded to the bars and not using clamps as they do in these modern times. But these also could again be CZ handlebars, because the Czechoslovakian factory did use this system to fit the levers on to the bars. Now, also back in the 1960s, plastic was still a few years away yet, and almost all British-built off-road bikes at that time were using alloy front and rear mudguards on their scramblers and trials bikes, and these again were light and could take a certain amount of punishment, but once they got broken, usually the only choice was to then replace them. But at the end of the day, this is still a very rare bike, this Dot CZ250 of Peter Remington's, and as I said, this might be the only living survivor of one of those Dot CZ combinations, because although there were 3 other official Works factory bikes made in 1963, nobody seems to know exactly what became of them, and who knows, there may be even 1 or 2 of them still tucked away in an old garage or workshop somewhere, yet to be rediscovered. But certainly we've still got this example here of Peter's to take a look at, and although this bike here was built by Dot back in 1993, it's more or less what the Works bikes would have looked like in 1963. But I'll wager that this was quite a little bike back in the day, because of that relatively light steel Dot chassis, and of course this powerful 2-stroke twin-port CZ250 engine, which, as I mentioned, already had a fantastic reputation for its power and reliability, being ridden by some of the biggest motocross stars of its day. But Peter's bike here is quite typical of the rare and unusual machines that you come across at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show each year, and for that reason I'm already looking forward to what I'm going to come across when I pay my next visit in 2024. Okay, so when we return to CDB TV, we'll be checking out this 1979 Cotton EMX, which is another bike that I came across at the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And as you can see, this bike still has all of its original patina from that year, and it's currently awaiting restoration by its owner, but it's still worthy of a quick look here on my YouTube channel. So I do hope you return to take a look at this British built classic. But for the time being, thanks once again for tuning in to my video channel, and we'll speak again very soon when we all revisit Classic Dirt Bike TV.